Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and this week, as every week, we're going to talk about an aspect of what's going on in AI, and one of our special foci is, what's going on in AI policy, and particularly with focus on national security policy recently. And so we're very happy to have back with us Paul Scharre. He's the executive vice president and director of studies at the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. He is the award-winning author of For Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. How are you doing, Paul?
Good. Great. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining. Obviously, what's on everybody's mind at the moment is, what does the election mean for these issues? What's going to change? What's not going to change? There are a couple of factors here. Obviously, everybody's talking about, Trump and what the Trump team will be, and we know some aspects of that. But also, we're clearly going to enter a period in which AI is a bigger issue, just simply because of the growth of AI. And on top of that, the president-elect has a number of people around him who are intimately involved with the AI community. And that's got a whole variety of implications, which we hope you will sort out for us. So what do you think are the biggest implications of the election for the issues you cover?
Yeah, awesome. Let me reach into the crystal ball here in the desk drawer. Right, and I think, look, very topical. I think we're all, sort of thinking through, all right, what does this new change of administration, change of Congress mean for a variety of issues? Let me cover maybe a couple big picture questions with AI, and then we can dive into some of the particulars. I think there are a couple. Look, right off the bat, you get a new administration, fresh set of eyes on problems. That's going to widen the aperture in terms of policy options that are on the table, right? But I think it's worth pointing out a couple of foundational things I think are not going to change. One is the view that AI is really important to U.S. competitiveness and to U.S. national security. That's a bipartisan view. Folks in the Trump administration and the president are likely to share that perspective. Two, the U.S. needs to stay ahead of China. That's not going to change. And in particular, the view that we need to find ways as a nation to run faster while holding China behind. I think we're going to see both of those elements sustained forward in the Trump administration. And in fact, when you look at sort of the particulars of AI policy, if you step away from maybe some of like the labeling, I think you actually see quite a bit of continuity through the first Trump administration into the Biden administration. I think that's likely to continue. So, for example, on technology restrictions going to China, we've seen a steady ratcheting up over the last 8 years. What really started in the first Trump administration of increased U.S. restrictions on U.S. technology going to China. And the Biden administration, kind of carried that forward, particularly with the export controls on chips. They came in place 2 years ago, and then they've refined since then. I don't think we're going to see that rolled back. No, there's no constituency here in the policy community of Washington for sending these really advanced chips to China. If anything, we might see the Trump administration take steps to further kind of crack down on that. Now, having said that, there are going to be areas where you do see different approaches. And I think in particular, there was a strong emphasis in the executive order out of the Biden administration about safety. And there's certainly people in Trump's orbit that are quite dismissive of concerns about AI safety. Not everyone, to be fair. But you're going to get a broad skepticism.
For example, hasn't Elon been on both sides of that issue?
Yeah, right. So on the one hand, Musk is a good example here of some of the different views because he himself embodies them. He's been named to this Doge group, whatever that's going to be, right? He's very hawkish on slashing government regulation. Obviously, as a businessman, he has strong views on government regulation areas I'm sure he'd like to see less. On the other hand, he's been an outspoken advocate of concerns about AI risk, right? And so, there is an element where if you take these risks seriously, you are going to need government regulation to manage them. So I think that'll be a tension that we'll see, and one where, you can see Trump going either way or even both ways on this topic of being certainly interested in reducing government regulation and freeing up the private sector. But I could certainly see a world where people get Trump's ear and he's like worried about AI risks and says we need to do something about them.
Well, right. Although philosophically, and I'm reluctant to throw the word philosophical around with regard to Trump, but philosophically, he and those around him seem predisposed against regulation and against government interference. So isn't it possible, or I would venture a little more likely, that on an issue like the one that you just mentioned, what you're likely to get is let's form some kind of public-private collaboration, get some volunteer measures by the industry to police itself, that kind of thing, as opposed to regulation.
Right. So let's talk about maybe some of the particulars. So President-elect Trump has said that he'll repeal the White House executive order on artificial intelligence. I think regardless of whether they get rid of that in practice or sort of rebrand it or in name, there are probably some policies that will continue and then some that are going to change. Again, I think on the tech restrictions to China, those will likely continue and ratchet up. There's a lot more that can be done internally on running faster, and in particular in terms of freeing up permitting for energy growth to meet all the demand for data centers and the extent to which they're very power hungry. And that's going to be important for U.S. competitiveness. But some of to be clear, we don't have like hard regulations in place today on the most capable AI models, right? Like people have floated ideas like a regulatory approach for a licensing regime, for example, like what we have for drugs, where you can't just put a drug out on the market. You have to get regulatory approval to show that it's safe and effective. It does not exist today. So there's nothing to repeal. What there is sort of the thing that might be on the table, and I think actually we're likely to see the White House walk away from, is a reporting requirement surrounding the most advanced AI models based on the amount of computation that they're using to train them. But that's the only requirement today, is just to report information. So we could see the administration repeal that. And then you might end up with what you're talking about, which is that companies continue to voluntarily share information anyways. But not, right? It could be the companies say, you know what, we'll be happy to go ahead and just keep that information close hold for now.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, that's the problem with voluntary agreements, is sometimes they don't work. But let's take an approach that's seldom taken here in Washington these days, at least in the conversations I've been in. What do you think? The Trump administration on these AI issues might do well or better than the Biden administration?
I think one place where you can make a strong case that we're seeing government regulation hold back U.S. progress in AI is on the energy infrastructure that's needed to complement the data center build-outs. That the growth of data centers is at a very rapid pace. And in order to make this work, you need the chips, you need places to build these data centers, you need land and permitting, and you need energy. They're very power intensive. And that's a place where what we are frequently hearing from folks is they're running into challenges in permitting, in getting the approval to then build that infrastructure. So that's a place where that is at risk of holding the U.S. back. And I think the real concern here is that we see then companies move to other countries, whether it's UAE or somewhere else, where they build their data centers, and then those countries become the places where the most capable AI models are trained and built. We absolutely want those trained here on U.S. soil and the computation being done here on U.S. soil, because that actually gives us then the ability to control how these chips are used if we want to, for example, regulate their use vis-a-vis competitors like China. Whereas if these data centers are somewhere else, we don't have the same level of control over them. And so that's a place where I think the administration could come in and clear away some regulations and then make it easier for companies to build out these data centers and keep pace with AI progress.
Trump's invitation to foreigners to invest in this country and say he's going to clear away the regulatory hurdles might entice foreigners to get into that business, because there's a big build out there. Isn't there also a risk that energy prices might go up for average consumers?
Well, that's another question, is then, okay, who's going to fund this? And so that's, I think, an important one, because it's certainly not fair to consumers, and it's not going to be politically good for anybody if we end up in a situation where the average American household sees their energy bill going up because some companies, building a data center next to them and then drawing more energy off the grid, or we're just supplementing and we're building new power plants. So figuring out who's going to foot the bill for that's going to be critically important.
In the area that you have been focused on, which is to say, or done a lot of focus on, which is to say national security, there seems to be two countervailing impulses. One impulse is give the military what they need, spend in that area. The other is we've got to cut spending across the board. Some people have said, sort of rethinking the military technologically might actually also result in some savings, going from big legacy systems to new tech. What's your view on how that may play out?
I mean, I do look, there's no question that there is fat to trim in the Defense Department's budget. And I'm supportive of efforts to do that. I also think it's true that realistically, if you want to have a military that is prepared to fight and win a war against China, while also simultaneously managing challenges elsewhere around the globe, having a military that can be prepared to defend NATO allies in Europe against Russia, respond to challenges in the Persian Gulf, for example, that we're going to have to spend more than we're spending now. That might mean that there's less pressure to cut on waste, but I think we're going to have to choose, what's a priority here. We've heard now for several years people in uniform and civilian experts across really the political spectrum, including in the Biden administration, talk about the dangers of China's military buildup, concern about the possibility that Xi Jinping makes a move against Taiwan in the relatively near future. If you were to believe those things seriously, we would do a lot of things that we're not doing now, right? If you really believe that we were entering a window of vulnerability for a war against China in the next few years, we should be putting the defense industrial base on a wartime footing now, dramatically scaling up munitions production. There's going to be some things that you can't do quickly, right? We're not going to build more aircraft carriers and more submarines in the next few years. Those things take decades. But we should be scaling up productions of missiles and bombs that you would need in a conflict. There are places where, for example, on drones, we can scale production fast and get those out, and those would be helpful in that kind of conflict. And we're just not doing it. To make all that happen, you are going to need more money. And so that's a possibility I think would be a welcome change. is if we saw a Trump military buildup and increase defense spending to make all that happen, because we're just not going to be able to meet the national security challenges we have at the current level of defense spending. I hate to say it, to be honest, because I would like to see more impetus for reform, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think we have to pick our battles.
In terms of competition with China, the strategy in the past has been, or during the Biden administration, small yard, high fence, keep them from getting certain technologies and so forth. It's already becoming clear that doesn't really work for a couple of reasons. One, there's certain technologies where they're ahead of us. Two, they have the capability to ramp up and develop their own alternatives, and they may not be quite as good as our alternatives. But particularly from a market perspective, there are plenty of places in the world that would like an 80% solution, don't really feel the need to spend a 100% solution, want to be involved, and the Chinese product could come along, be a little cheaper and have fewer strings, and that could build them a base. Do you think there's a room for adjustment in those policies or no?
Oh, there's no question that I think there's a lot more that we could be doing in terms of how we manage the technology competition with China. Some of them might be additional technologies that we might need to restrict, or just focusing on enforcement. And I think the chip export controls are a good example here, where we have put in place nominally restrictions on these certain types of really advanced AI chips going to China. They're still showing up in China because they're being routed through third-party vendors. They're being smuggled there effectively. And so more enforcement actually could have a really big impact potentially in cutting off some of these chips to China. But it's true that that's not the case across the board with all technologies. We need to take China seriously as a technology competitor. That means investing here at home. And we started to see efforts to do industrial policy here in the U.S. with the CHIPS Act and other efforts, but we don't really have the analytic tools in the government to do it effectively. So we need better analytic tools in the Commerce Department and other parts of the government to be able to assess, are our policies working? Are they effective? Are we cutting off the right things? Are we investing in the right things? If we're going to take these tools of economic statecraft seriously, we need to actually be investing in making sure that we have the expertise to do that. And I think similarly, we need to have a proactive agenda globally so that we are actually competing effectively around the world with countries that, you're right, they might be fine with the good enough solution from Huawei or some other Chinese company that's maybe not as effective as some U.S., but it's close enough and it's cheaper, and China's going to give them a bunch of other goodies. And so what does a proactive technology agenda look like for the United States so that we can ensure that wherever possible, it's digital infrastructure that's being laid in by the U.S. or other allies and partners instead of China?
A final sort of related question in this thread before I go on to another one. You mentioned the CHIPS Act. As an old veteran, I use the term loosely, of the Commerce Department. When I was working in the Commerce Department, I can assure you it was pretty irrelevant. We did our best, but the problem with the Commerce Department was we didn't have a lot of money to spend. But most of the money in the Commerce Department went for salaries, right? There wasn't a lot of programming money. During the Biden administration, that changed dramatically with the CHIPS and Science Act, and all of a sudden, the Commerce Department was responsible for tens of billions of dollars, but also played this central regulatory role. Gina Raimondo, as the Commerce Secretary, had this enormous job. Howard Lutnick, the incoming Commerce Secretary, has zero background in this area. Do you think the role of the Commerce Department is likely to continue? And more important than that, do you think the move towards onshoring chip production away from places like Taiwan that are vulnerable is also likely to continue?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the Commerce Department is likely to only grow in importance in terms of U.S. national security. And frankly, we need to adequately resource the Commerce Department to ensure that they have the analytic expertise that they need to be enforcing these policies effectively and judging them. So I think we need to, if you look at like the defense enterprise, for example, we have this massive analytic enterprise of people that exist not just in the Defense Department and the military services, but also with federally funded research and development corporations that are thinking through different scenarios and analyzing different types of military hardware. And we just don't have that kind of analytic backbone on the economic statecraft side, and we absolutely need that. And then in terms of, the particulars, sorry, what was the second half of your
onshoring? This is I know
I can only hold one thought in my head at a time.
I'm a riveting conversationalist, but no, it's onshoring.
CHIPS Act. Look, so here's the thing. I think there's like a couple different kinds of goals we should be trying to accomplish with the CHIPS Act, and I think it's a fair criticism that the CHIPS Act has to date been, I think, a little bit unfocused. One goal is, yes, we would like to diversify manufacturing of advanced chips from Taiwan. Right now, Taiwan is this like significant point of geopolitical risk because it is the sole point where the most advanced chips are made. And we want to try to diversify that and have more advanced node manufacturing either here in the United States or in other allied countries, just to diversify that kind of risk. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think we want to reshore a critical mass of advanced node manufacturing here in the United States for the purpose of having an ecosystem here in the U.S. of companies that are helping to sustain that. And that doesn't necessarily need to be like enough that we wouldn't see disruption in the case of Taiwan, but it's really to feed a broader ecosystem where right now the export controls that we have on chip making equipment to China have teeth. Because in order to make the most advanced chips, which are made in Taiwan, they rely on U.S. technology. And in particular, U.S. equipment suppliers and U.S. software suppliers supply the software that's needed to make these most advanced chips. We want that to sustain into the next generation of chip technology. So whatever the sort of next generations are of chip making equipment, we want as much of that to come from the United States as possible, wherever the chips are made, because that gives us these key points of leverage over the technology. And so having an ecosystem here in the United States helps to sustain U.S. scientists and engineers and U.S. companies. And so I think that's another kind of key reason. What that suggests, though, is that we shouldn't get sort of distracted, I would say, by legacy manufacturing, legacy chips. I think older nodes, that should be a second priority, and we really need to be focused on this ecosystem of advanced node manufacturing and sustaining U.S. companies that are right now really these critical components that enable all of the export controls that we're putting in place.
By the way, as an aside, and I may have mentioned this on prior episodes of Still Consciousness, but I recently had the chance to sit and talk to some people associated with a large chip manufacturer. And we were talking about what percentage of the chips in their space were made in Taiwan. It was a very high percentage. And then they pointed to all the other items on the platform in which the chips resided. And they said, but don't forget, a lot of these other items, fasteners and things like that, they come from China. And so we often talk about the high tech, but a lot of the electronic guts of these things are sourced out of China, right?
Right. Well, so that's another angle here, right? Which is to say that China is the manufacturing hub of the world, and particularly for microelectronics, China is the largest consumer of semiconductors, but in large part because then they're integrating them into other pieces of electronics equipment that are sold around the world, including here to the United States. Now, President-elect Trump has talked about 60% tariffs on goods from China. And so we certainly will see a lot of action out of the Trump administration on trade with China. And I think there's an opportunity, if done well, to put in place policies, including tariffs, that might create incentives for companies to reshore manufacturing, if not to the United States, just out of China, which is a net benefit to the U.S. If we see manufacturing leave China and go elsewhere, that reduces supply chain risk for us, depending on where it goes, of course, so that we're not so completely dependent on China in ways that we've seen can certainly be problematic.
Yeah. I predict, you didn't ask me a question, but I will tell you, I predict that one of the most interesting things to watch in the Trump administration will be the divergence of views on how we should treat China. Because a lot of the people around Trump have very close relations with China, and he has a predisposition to deal. He also has people around him who are pro-tariff and who are super hawks. And in the Biden administration, there were no sort of people who are saying, let's have a somewhat softer policy, or very few. It was mostly kind of hawkish. And it was a degree of hawkishness. But here there's a real tension, I think. I don't know if you agree.
Well, it's true. And we saw this in the first Trump administration, when we saw this continual tension in the trade policies with China of, are we trying to force China to the table for a deal, a grand bargain on trade to get a better deal for the United States, or are we trying to decouple the United States and China? And you had people in both camps in the Trump administration, and the president himself would sort of veer between those two.
Right.
And I think it's entirely possible we see that tension carried out here again, because you're right. He loves nothing more than the idea of him sort of being the ultimate deal maker and getting some great deal. And, we could end up in a world where, okay, there are very significant trade restrictions. And if that can force China to the table for a better deal, great. And if not, okay, then we'll go ahead and see the U.S. and Chinese economies continue to further separate. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out there's still an enormous record level of trade between the U.S. and China. But on some key areas, like in technology, we have seen some selective decoupling.
Yeah. Still 80,000 U.S. businesses doing business over there. Right. Okay, last question. And thank you for your time. But Trump has picked a controversial guy to be his AI czar, David Sachs. Do you have any thoughts on him?
No, we'll see. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what he does. I think, we've seen in the sort of out of a lot of people coming from the tech community in Silicon Valley, this strong anti-government kind of approach of we don't want government regulation, which frankly the tech sector has been very successful in fending off in general, not just in AI, but also in social media, in privacy. So I think we're likely to see, a much more business-friendly kind of approach. But I think we'll have to see what the particulars look like. And again, I think one of the big question marks is going to be to what extent the administration takes the risk coming out of AI seriously and how they respond as a result. Because you do have some people that are in Trump's orbit that see that as a concern. I think we'll see.
We shall. But I do think this has been a useful, constructive conversation, as I knew it would be, because the first reaction to Trump from a lot of people was, oh my God, here we go again. The reality, particularly in areas like AI, is we've never really been here before. AI is completely different in terms of its significance. And there are some areas where the people around him are extremely, and some areas where they're completely unqualified. There are some areas where they are extremely qualified and have some views. And so this will be one to watch very closely, and it will be very important, quite apart from the politics of it all. So hopefully we will get you back here in the new year to talk about those things. But for now, Paul, thanks again for great conversation. And everybody, thanks for listening. And, there'll be more Silla Consciousness each and every week. And of course, in the new year, a little sort of later in January, we'll start a second AI podcast focusing on energy, climate, and AI. So talk to you about that as it approaches. Until then, thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.